Almost 200 years ago, work began on the original Erie Canal. It was a time before there was even a single engineering college in America, and when the only power available for their tools was from their own muscles or those of their animals. But they would overcome every challenge, not the least of which was this massive cliff of solid rock. Where did they do that? And why did they choose the place they did? Here, not far from Buffalo, the Niagara River above Niagara Falls serves as the headwaters of the Erie Canal. About 200 miles to the east, near Rome, New York, this dam in the Mohawk River creates a lake that also is the headwaters of the Erie Canal. How can both of these be true? Straight roads like this are common, of course, but not many can boast the amount of history that's behind these two that cross the Erie Canal in western New York State. What's their story? And what do all of these have to do with Loctite?
We're here on the Erie Canal for our vacation, my husband and I and our two kids, and we're very excited to be here. We've really enjoyed our trip so far. This is our second day out. It's very relaxing and calm, and we all get to take a turn driving the boat. When we're out on our boat, sometimes it's a little bit rough, but this is nice and calm, and we've really enjoyed it.
We actually started out in Macedon, I think is how you say it. We chugged up just past Lock 33 just to go west a little bit. We spun around and now we're just going to head back east, and we're going to try to go as far east as we can before we have to return the boat by next Saturday.
It's very cool. I didn't know what to expect, but going in both directions is fun. You know, you get as close to the wall as you can, and people in two positions on the boat keep it snug to the wall, and whether you're going up or down, it's very easy, so I think anyone can do it.
My name's David. I am right now just trying to keep the boat near the wall, because as the water goes in and out of the locks, the turbulence moves the boats around left and right and forward and backwards, so we got to keep it near the wall so it doesn't crash around into the walls or other boats. Just waiting for the water to get finished drained out, and then the lock doors will open and we'll move on out the lock.
The Erie Canal has been called, and it is, a man-made river. Like any river, the Erie has to flow downhill. Unlike a river, though, a canal has to go downhill with level stretches of constant water depth using giant steps called locks. These elevators for boats each look and work much the same. The lock chamber is enclosed by two steel miter gates, which allow the operator to raise or lower the water level inside the chamber by a system of underground valves and plumbing. To a boater using a lock, the process may seem simple. But let's listen to an experienced lock operator as we watch a locking up operation at 10 times normal speed.
First thing we would do is we turn on our MG set, which changes AC power to DC power, because when these were built back in the 1918, I think this lock was commissioned, they had DC power. We made our own power for the next lock up with a power plant. So we have to turn that on first, lock down the lower end, and open up the lower valves. With 9x7 valves, the water just seeks its own level by gravity. There's no pumps involved. Once it's equal on both sides of the gates, then the gate can be opened. If there's foot difference in water level in between the chamber and the lower gates, the gates won't open because of the pressure, the way the miter. So once that's equal on both sides, you open up the gates, turn the green light on down below, let the boat in, close the lower gates, close the lower valves, and walk up to the upper end and fill with the upper valves by just cracking the valves a little bit. First of all, people, when they do pull in, they have to pull in alongside whatever side they want. It's their choice most of the time. Sometimes you might have to tell them to what side to, but most of the time, whatever side they feel comfortable on, you let them go to. But if they got a small boat, they should hold on to a cable or a line in the middle of the boat. And let's say we'll crack the valves a little bit, favoring the valve that's on the side that they're on so that you push them up against the wall. It's our job as the operator to make sure that they're pushed up against the wall. And as you get more water underneath them, you can open the valves up a little bit more because the turbulence is less and less. And then when you're about halfway up, there's not much turbulence along, you can move them pretty fast up. And then in a matter of 10 to 12 minutes, they get to the top level, 25 feet higher. And again, them upper gates won't open until the water pressure is equal on both sides. Once the water gets up to each side, you open up the gates and let them out, and they've gone from the lower level to the upper level, 25-foot difference in water level.
The rule of thumb is that every foot a boat is raised or lowered in an Erie Canal lock takes 100,000 gallons of water. That means that in order to bring those two boats up that 25 feet, 2.5 million gallons had to come from somewhere to fill that lock. There are no pumps used anywhere in this process. All of the water comes from here, upstream. Let's stand by this shallow pond that's connected to the canal by this narrow channel and watch what 2.5 million gallons in 10 minutes looks like from here. This tide-like surging is repeated every time the lock is filled. Now watch as that same lock that's been filled with water is emptied downstream. It shouldn't surprise us now to see that on busy days, when boat traffic is greatest, a lot of water can go downstream from one of these locks. In fact, in some sections, high traffic and dry summers can put a strain on the canal's supply sources and on the canal staff trying to manage water levels.
Anytime you're operating, just a normal thing for me to look at the gauge because they're right outside each control stand. One's down below, you look at them. One's up above, you look at them. And you can, if the water level happens to be going down and you know it's going to keep going down, and keep an eye on it, thinking, maybe sometime during the day you're going to have to make a change in the bypass. Like today we made a change. We probably, and the water level still seems to be going down, so we might make another change tonight to see if the water level doesn't start to recuperate. And actually we keep in touch with the next lockdown and see what they have on their gauge. And between the two of us, we kind of consult about how much we should open and close.
This water flowing around Lock 32 means that the supply of water being sent downstream from the west is more than the lock itself needs to operate. This section of the canal west of Syracuse is supplied by two principal sources, the Niagara River near Buffalo and the Genesee River at Rochester. Both provide an ample natural supply that, as we'll soon see, the Adirondack region lacked. The supply here is so abundant, in fact, that Lock 32 has a feature found nowhere else on the Erie.
My name's Andy Cook. I'm a kayak instructor here at Lock 32 Whitewater Course, which is on the Erie Canal in Pittsford, New York. We have about 30 members who come here, but we have a ton more people who just stop in for a day, and a lot of people come for classes and stuff throughout the summer. Without this course, we kayakers from Rochester would probably have to drive quite a ways. In the summer, for basically June, July, August, and part of September, we really have to drive up to Watertown, which is a whole 3 hours away. So we really appreciate this course for a chance to get in the water and practice stuff and stay in shape during the summer.
Let's send a boat down the Erie from the west at the Niagara River. The 35 locks it encounters will lower it over 570 feet by the time it reaches the Hudson River near Albany. The 345-mile trip could take the boat as little as a week. Answer this, though. How long would you say it will take for the water entering the canal with the boat to make the same trip? You might already know about the Genesee crossing at Rochester, but let's assume for the question that some of our starting water makes it past that spot.
The Genesee River crosses the canal up in Genesee Valley Park, just south of Rochester, and the water coming from Lake Erie is coming down there and kind of diverts into the river, and we kind of catch what the river's coming downstream from the river. So basically, there might be some Lake Erie water leaks through there, but I would say the majority of it is the Genesee River water.
Well, regardless of its source, the water in the Erie continues to flow eastward from Rochester, along with our boat, on its way down to Albany. Have you made your guess yet? Here's a hint. We've learned that it's the water pushing against this miter gate that keeps it tightly closed. It follows that as the water flows downhill on its course along the Erie, these miter gates must always be pointing upstream against that flow. Now compare this lock with another. Both are on the Erie Canal, and both are viewed from the south looking north. The supply of water coming downstream from the Niagara River from the west, along with the Genesee and other sources along the way, could easily supply all of the locks all the way to the Hudson. But they don't. And the reason for that is
because there's a high spot in the canal called the Rome Summit level.
the Rome Summit, as its name implies, is the high point of the Erie in the Adirondack region. Now, high terrain in itself might not seem like much of a problem. That is, after all, what locks are for. The problem was that locks need water to work. And as we've seen, pumps aren't used anywhere in this process. That means that in order for this boat to get up that hill, a source of water is needed from above that can not only supply the locks to the west to lift this boat, but that can also do double duty by supplying those to the east as well.
The Rome summit level is the highest point in the canal, and at that point water runs in both directions, essentially east and west.
Water running in both directions from the top of a hill? What source could possibly keep up with that? The Niagara River's virtually unlimited supply was enough to have driven all of the Erie's locks with water to spare. But at the top of the Rome summit, this gentle stream called the Mohawk River would have to do just twice the work being asked of the Niagara in the west, feeding locks in both directions from Rome if the modern barge canal was to succeed. What was needed was a reservoir that could be fed by the Mohawk and that could be drawn on to meet the needs of the canal's locks even during high traffic periods and in dry summers. This was the town of Delta, located on the Mohawk River just a few miles north of Rome. In 1912, Delta would become one of the keys to solving the Erie's supply problem in this region.
The Delta Lake is interesting because the village of Delta was totally submerged, and some buildings were moved, others were destroyed, and some are still there, I guess. The need for the water to supply the current barge canal was much greater than even the improved Erie. And this, of course, was another reason that the Delta Lake reservoir was built. And also, essentially, during periods of low flow, when water was a scarce commodity, they needed the capacity of a large reservoir.
The stretch westward off the Rome summit, through locks 21 and 22, through Oneida Lake and Lock 23, is the only section of the Erie that flows from east to west. Here's a view of Lock 21 that we saw a few minutes ago. Notice the direction the miter gate is pointing. This water meets the water coming from the west, and they join to form the Oswego River, flowing northward to Lake Ontario. Did you get the right answer about the water entering the Erie from the Niagara with our boat?
So what happens to water from the Niagara River? How long does it take to get to the Hudson River?
Well, the Niagara River doesn't get to the Hudson River. It goes out the Oswego River.
They tell us that 12,000 years ago, Niagara Falls began here, 7 miles downstream at what is now Lewiston, New York. This ledge of rock is known as the Niagara Escarpment, and as this 19th century map shows, it runs from southern Ontario, across western New York, gradually fading in prominence as it approaches Rochester. The escarpment doesn't show up on most highway maps today. Hills and rock like this aren't that difficult for modern highway building after all, but it's not surprising to find it featured prominently on this 1825 map of the Erie Canal, as getting the canal over this cliff was one of the great engineering feats of the early 19th century. The designers of the canal back then could have surveyed a course to the south, keeping the canal always above this ledge. But the level ground to the north was chosen, making it inevitable that the solid rock of the escarpment would eventually have to be scaled with locks. The place that they chose to do that became known as, what else? Lockport.
Of course, Lockport found out that it was going to be chosen as a site for the locks based upon the surveys that were done by Judge James Geddes in the early 1800s, 1808, 1810 region. What was constructed here in Lockport in the 1820s was called the Flight of Five. 5 locks would be built to ascend the Niagara Escarpment for travel towards Buffalo, and 5 more would be built right next to it to descend the Niagara Escarpment for folks who were headed east and on towards Albany. It's the only place on the Erie Canal where that was attempted, and the only place where a succession of locks was built so that two-way traffic could be accommodated on the Erie Canal.
When we try to piece together the reasons they chose Lockport, we're left having to do some guesswork. Was it the 18-mile creek that had been carving a notch at this location for millennia? Or perhaps the Indian Trail that had become a road crossing from Batavia to the southeast and continuing toward Lewiston and on to Fort Niagara to the northwest? Roads would have been important to the project for movement of men and construction supplies, but did this road to those locations accomplish that? There was a road that crossed Lockport then that may have played a forgotten role in this city's history. It's a road that leaves a large footprint to this day, and that would have offered overland access to the growing community that we now call Buffalo to the south. It was one of a pair of highways that had been cut through the wilderness by a survey team for the Holland Land Company. The year? 1799. Almost 20 years before work on the Erie Canal was begun.
They were baselines, survey baselines, authorized by the agent of the Holland Land Company, who was Joseph Ellicott. He authorized the surveying as the first baselines. They surveyed across the border between Pennsylvania and New York and got their original east-west baseline, and then they proceeded north on both the east and westerly transit meridians. And they're called transit meridians because Benjamin Ellicott, Joseph Ellicott's brother, had just invented the transit, and it was started to be called that, and so they called them transit lines because they were being run by a transit. They became roads because of the fact that the surveyors cut the line, cleaned it right down to the I don't know whether they ever took the stumps out or not, but at least they took the trees out. They created an open path in a wilderness of trees, and if you wanted to travel in that general direction, that was the only opening that you could find to travel on.
Of these two survey lines, the eastern one that crosses a sparsely populated region today leaves a small footprint. But to the west, near today's city of Buffalo, transit road is this Route 78, as it traces Ellicott's line northward toward Lake Ontario. As we've said, we don't know how important this survey road was to the decision to build the locks where they did. Nor do we know the role it may have played in their success in completing them. What we can say is that Ellicott's line crossed the escarpment then, where it does today. Here, 500 feet from one of the most important construction sites in American history. It's still there almost 200 years later, under that bridge just 1 block away. The world-famous Flight of Five at Lockport. When Thomas Jefferson heard of the plan to build the Erie Canal, he said, "Making a canal 350 miles through a wilderness is little short of madness. Perhaps in 100 years. So, New York State decided to go ahead on its own and build it anyway. It took thousands of laborers working over 8 years. And perhaps the greatest miracle was that the designers who supervised the work had no previous experience with canals whatever. Or maybe that's why they believed they could. On October 26, 1825, a cannon was fired at a ceremony in Buffalo. The locks at Lockport had been completed at last, and the Erie Canal was declared finished and open for business.
Fire!
We hope you've enjoyed our show. Our goal is to go on producing stories about the Grand Erie Canal, and we can use your help with story ideas for future programs and by supporting and recommending our contributors. Classic Craft Woodworks Custom Cedar Watercraft, and Stephen Drew, certified in long-term care planning and serving clients in Central and Western New York. For copies of this or any of our programs, or to reach us for any reason, visit our website at www.lowbridgeproductions.com. And thanks for watching.